So yes, I did want to make sure everybody knew, I declare myself an ENFP with ADHD. So if you are familiar with the Myers-Briggs, that's what I'm talking about with the ENFP and ADHD. So please know that documentation, being organized, stuff like that does not come naturally to me. So I strongly believe that if I can learn it, you can too. And I will say, hey, for me, that requires a little bit of help with medication for the ADHD too. So whatever strategies are needed. But I want you guys to think, and you can see my screen, right? I should check. Okay, cool. So I want you to think in your head, and whether or not you want to share this with us, what is your biggest struggle with writing notes? So most people know right off the bat what that is, but think to yourself, and that is what I want you to focus on as I am talking. Oh, looks like we're drawing some lines on here. I'm not sure how, but that's what you want to think about, because I could go a million different directions. I have a ton of resources I can share, but really, what is your biggest struggle? Like, what is the question you want answered? We will definitely allow some time for Q&A, but what is, the big concern that you have? And let me just check in the chat here to see. Cool. So some of you have been brave enough to share, writing too much or too long, wanting to make sure that you've captured enough information, but then not going into too much detail, not understanding the words that you wrote when you reread them. Yes. Just getting them done. How much to write, how much detail. Do you do them right away or wait? Using clinical verbiage. Yeah. Overthinking it. Awesome. These are all so common. This is not a topic that we talk about a lot in general, and yet it is a huge source of shame and fear for a lot of therapists. So I want you to know that you're not alone if you are experiencing any of those things. And let's see if I exit out, maybe it'll take, I'm not sure how these little red stripes got on there, but oh well, looks like we might have to deal with them. So one quote that I thought was really helpful, because I think we think of notes and it becomes just like we were talking about. It's a very, we get a reaction, an emotional reaction when we think of notes, right? And so immediately we're like, oh my gosh, it's this big problem. But really, like, we need to kind of, take a pause and think about what is the purpose of notes. And that, I think, helps us to figure out what we can do to then make it easier. So I like this quote. It says, a good set of progress notes is like a map for the counseling professional, a map that reveals roadblocks to progress and discloses the direction in which therapy is going. So really, this is, I like to think of your client files as kind of like the documentation of a story. It's just the story of your client's journey with you. And really, when we boil it down, that's what we're doing. Yes, there's ethics involved. Yes, there's certain things we want to add in there, and we can get as detailed as we want about that, but that's the essence of what we're doing, right? And I do want to kind of bust some myths real quick here. So, number one, there's no one perfect way to write notes. This is, everybody wants me to say, how do I write notes? How do I do it? There is no one way. And that's a good thing. That also means if you feel like however you write notes isn't working for you, there's probably, there's something you can change, because it's not like the way you're doing it now is the one perfect way, right? So hopefully that gives some hope. There's also no perfect template or formula. So a lot of people have been told by a supervisor, like, this is how you have to write notes. And that's really not the case unless you're, working at like an agency or working for someone who specifically does have, a system you have to follow. Oh, thanks. Somebody got rid of the little lines. Really, the most important thing is that you find a style that works for you. So if what's not working for you, if what you're doing right now is not working for you, let's find something different. So I want to talk about kind of looking at these. I have this framework. It's easy to remember, called QUOTE, and that it covers kind of like these 4 common roadblocks that I've seen in writing notes. And I think most of you will identify with one or maybe a couple of these. And this is really where then you can know what to do to solve your note writing problem and make it more simple. And I am going to share actually some very specific strategies and templates too after we're done. So number one is questioning. So if you were the person who, someone put in the chat, right, that they write it and then they're overthinking it. They're, you know, writing it, maybe writing it again. People who are like you're typing your note or writing your note, and then you're like, oh, wait, is that what I need to do? And constantly questioning what you're writing. Also the people who said, wondering about like clinical verbiage, right? Like basically you're wondering, do your notes sound professional enough? Which is a really common concern, right? So if you find that that's you, that's kind of the big thing to focus on here is like, am I just constantly questioning what I write? Is it good enough? Is it the right information that's in my note? The next one is constantly thinking about others. So someone wrote in the chat, you know, you're afraid of having your notes subpoenaed, right? So that's one of the most common concerns I hear. If one of your biggest blocks is maybe not necessarily that you're questioning it, wanting it to sound professional enough, but it's more that you're focused on that because you're scared of who's going to read your notes, that is one of the most common blocks I see. So that might be, you're afraid your notes are going to be subpoenaed. You're afraid, I hear a lot of people say like, oh, what if, you know, my notes were read in court? I don't want them to harm my client or whatever. And I'm here to tell you that your job is to document what you're doing. Your job is not to worry about what an attorney may or may not, highly unlikely, but may or may not twist and do with your words to help or harm your client. That's not your job. So please be free from that stress and that burden. If you are going to court, there are different things I would say. You do still want to prepare yourself for something like that, right? Like that is still a very nerve-wracking thing, and you want to be prepared for what happens there. However, your job is not to sit there and think about every note you write with every client, how it could potentially harm them in court. And I've got plenty of lawyers in my family, and if anyone is a good attorney, they can take anything and twist it to say whatever they want it to say. Right? They can make it do what they want it to do for their case, whether it's good or bad. And then they're going to go and have lunch with the other attorney on, you know, the other side of the case. So that's just what they do. It's not personal for them. So know that too. The next one is time. So you might actually feel fairly comfortable doing your notes. And one of the biggest struggles is just getting them done. Right? So this is a really common one I see for very legitimate reasons. It's not because you are irresponsible or, you know, not paying attention or not planning out your time well. A lot of what I see with people who have struggled with time, and these are people who have maybe fallen behind in notes by months. You know, they need to catch up on months worth of notes or need to catch up on hundreds of notes. So that can be, that's a huge, huge burden to bear that I see so many people struggling with. And a lot of times I'll see it's things like, I got in a car accident and had to have surgery, and all of a sudden I couldn't type as well, or I couldn't work the same hours I thought I could before. It might be someone like me with ADHD who kind of struggles with time management in general, right? Or it might be someone, if you're working at an agency or if you're working you know, in a private practice setting where maybe like you aren't the one bringing the clients in and you're told how many clients you have, then sometimes the expectations are unrealistic, right? So I know that was the case for me when I started out. Like you were just expected to work extra hours to get the work done. So, so it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to blame yourself or shame yourself if time is really just the biggest issue with getting your notes done. But it does mean, you know, again, we're just kind of identifying what is the issue here so we can then work on it. So the last one in our quote framework is emotions. So another one I hear, another common block I hear about a lot is, for example, if you're a therapist who does a lot of trauma work, then writing the notes is bringing up all the stuff that you were dealing with in session. Right? Or if you have a difficult client, whatever emotions you were having to manage in the session are going to come up when you're writing the note. And so I'll hear a lot of times people saying that they need they kind of like, they need to prepare themselves, right? It's like, I can't just sit down and write a note. It's not this, unemotional clinical task. It's actually really impacting them. That can be good and bad. So, it just is what it is. So in some ways, I'll also hear people say like, okay, when I sit down and write the note, then it feels done. It's like I'm releasing it, I'm letting it go. And I think that can be a really like healthy way to look at difficult sessions and difficult clients. But it also it does make it harder sometimes to sit down and write the note, right? And it can make it harder while you're doing it. And it's something to be aware of when you're writing your notes. If you know that those emotions come up, then probably sitting and writing your notes at 10 p.m. while you're watching TV isn't the best way to manage that, right? So we gotta like know what's triggering us or what might be impacting us, and then do our part to manage those things. Okay, so it looked like we kind of had actually like a mix of people with all of those different types of topics. And someone said, yeah, that note taking is difficult because therapy is difficult, right? Yes, it's not linear. And just like therapy, there's no one way to do it. And there's no way I can tell you this is how you write this note. It requires your critical judgment and your critical thinking. So let me just check our time. Okay. So real quick, I am going to just kind of like briefly browse through like what's the stuff you want to capture in a note, and then I'm going to go through how you can put that in a template that's personalized for you so that it saves you time writing notes. And then I know someone at the beginning of the call had mentioned about, or call, like I'm in a meeting, the summit, had mentioned about like, I think doing therapy with kids online and normally doing the notes during the session. So we can talk about like specifics like that afterwards too. So really, what do you want to put in your notes? This is one of the big questions. And honestly, if time is an issue, if questioning yourself is an issue, right? If what emotional stuff comes up for you is an issue, all of that applies to this. So you want to kind of stick to the general theme or topic of the session that occurred. You don't need to include all the details of every little thing or every story that the client talked about. If there are major things, like if there was you were making a change in the way you're going to do treatment, like you're going to refer someone to a psychiatrist, for example, that would be an important thing to put in a note, right? Because that's relevant to treatment. Or one example I like to use is I was seeing a client who came to see me to deal with, she was struggling with being a manager and having a lot of conflict at work because of this person she was supervising. So she came to me to kind of work through what was going on for her. And then her father passed away in the middle of our treatment together. So obviously that was a complete change that, was something we had to address and started working on as well. So that's something that's important to note. And really, I like this phrase. This is from the paper office for the digital age. It says, make your words a camera. And that's really kind of what you're doing. You're letting us in, you're giving us a snapshot of the session with your notes. I am not going to dig into this one because we're going to review it. But I will say one thing that a lot of people struggle with is kind of like what interventions to write. And that's where maybe you're concerned about, does it sound clinical enough? Does it sound like, professional enough? Or maybe after the session, you're like, I don't know. I just don't know how to put it into words. And that's why it takes so long, right? And you just sit there kind of with the blank page trying to figure out what you did. So one thing I like to think of is the grandma rule. So I call this the grandma rule. And this helps you kind of determine, like, is this relevant to put in a note? Because I tend to be one of those people that will write a lot. I'll just because I can type really fast, and most people are on either end of the spectrum. You write very little or too much, right? We all going to kind of try to be in the middle. But the grandma rule is really thinking, so someone is paying you to do therapy, right? You are being paid to provide therapy to this person. And that means that you have special skills. You have special training, knowledge, and what you're doing in session is a lot of different things. You're doing the basic human human interaction piece. You're making eye contact, you're building rapport, you're offering empathy, you, my mind went blank, but you're doing these kind of basic things you would expect in any human interaction. So if it's something that you would expect someone's grandmother, assuming we have a good relationship with grandma, right? If you would expect someone's grandma to do that for them, that's likely something you don't need to include in your note. So I would see a lot of people talking about things like active listening, like writing the phrase active listening in their note. Well, honestly, like, I have a good relationship with my grandmother. If I talk to her, I kind of expect that she's actively listening to me. If I pay a therapist, I kind of expect they're actively listening to me, right? Like, that's kind of a given. So you want to think about the other things, the other types of interventions that you're providing that are specific to you, that require you to have a master's degree, right? To be able to see somebody. That's the type of stuff we want to focus on in our note. It doesn't mean, and again, there's never like a black and white rule with notes. So it doesn't mean that that might not be appropriate to talk about those other things with certain clients. But I would say in general, those aren't things that most people are expecting to be the sole purpose of therapy. So let me switch over here. Okay, you can see this therapy interventions list. Yes, okay, cool. So, so I will share these resources with you all so you can have a copy of this. So this is something I created because I heard from so many people, the interventions part is one of the things that really gets people stuck with notes. And one way to save yourself a lot of time with notes, make it easier, and actually make them more clinically relevant to you, make it easier so that they serve a purpose, that you could easily go back and reference them. Someone else could easily go back and reference them, is to have kind of a prepared interventions list. But one thing I don't necessarily like is I'll see a lot of these types of cheat sheets for notes are just like, there's no blank. You'll see here I'm highlighting this little line underneath assessed. So most things that I see, it'll just be a checkbox and it'll say assessed. And people will just go in. So if you use an electronic health record, this is really common. You just kind of go in and check off like motivational interviewing, assessment, CBT, and that's it, right? That tells me nothing. Like, well, what does that mean you did? Right? And when I say that, I want you to think about how does that help you as the therapist? Because one of the most common reason you'll actually go back and look at your notes, or the most common reason anyone will go back and look at your notes, is that you will go back and look at your notes because you need to review something that's going on with your client. So you want to have notes that answer those questions for you and highlight that information. And when you have a little bit more detail, it helps a lot. But for those of you like me who write a lot, I find that having something like this, like a little cheat sheet, helps a lot, because if I have to think of like a full sentence to write, like that's part of it, right? Like I'm sitting there and analyzing the whole thing, and then I'm, maybe writing too much. Whereas if I have something where I can check off assessed and then quickly write in here when it was that I assessed, that's going to save so much time. So I'm going to give you guys this. I do not recommend that you just copy all of these and then paste them. I would say go through the list, like set a timer so you don't obsess over it, right? Just go through the list, pick like 10 to maybe 15. Try to stick to around 10 and put those in your notes. And that's your intervention section. That's what you did for that note for that session. And then what you want to do anytime you do something like this, then you reevaluate it. Right? So you might find, well, I thought I was going to use, I don't know, this intervention all the time, and that's why I selected it, but actually I haven't used it for anybody over the last 2 months. So then maybe you take that one out and put something else in, or you just take it out, right? So know that it is a fluid thing. It's something that, if you're in a private practice anyways, right? If you're making decisions about how you write your notes, this is something you can choose to do. Okay. I have some other examples of kind of like how this looks, like an intake note, where maybe you could add off like little check boxes for specific things that you did. Or I like doing this in intake notes because pretty much in every intake, every time that it's like the first session you have with a client, you're doing these certain things with everyone, right? So this way you're not having to just like ignore that or write the same thing over and over. Just save yourself time. So I'm going to give you guys some links to some of these templates so you can see the examples, and definitely a link to this therapy interventions list. But let's go ahead and cover any questions you have, since we just have a few minutes left.
Awesome, Maelissa, thank you so much. Definitely, everyone, if you have questions, please comment, and we will get you up on the screen to ask them. One question I hear a lot actually in the group is like, when should you be taking notes? Because we hear a lot about like concurrent documentation, and it's kind of split pretty evenly on that. Some people say doing notes in session takes away from the client. Others say that like if they don't do that, they're going to get buried. What's your take on that?
Yes, really, really common question. So because it's so common and because of the whole ADHD thing, I dug into the research on this and really have like a whole training, research-based training on it. And the deal is, we as therapists often don't want to share our notes. And so the idea of concurrent documentation, which is literally like you're writing your notes with your client, is very scary. And I think that has to do with our own fear that we are not doing our notes well, and the fact that nobody ever reads our notes. It's not something we're used to other people seeing. However, I would say if what you're doing now isn't working, it is absolutely something to try. So when people try concurrent documentation or collaborative documentation, they, about 75% of clients like it and want to continue doing it. And then same with therapists, most therapists want to continue doing it. So there's a lot of research that shows if you try it, you'll like it. The research also shows it takes about 6 to 8 weeks to get comfortable doing it. So it's not something you try for a week or two and then say, this doesn't work for me. Know that it will take some time to get used to doing that. I would also say if you're someone, for example, like the person at the beginning of the call who said, I'm kind of used to taking notes during the session, but now during COVID or, doing online stuff, I can't. One other way to do collaborative documentation is to do it at the end of the session and kind of use it as a way to end. So you say like the last 5 minutes of the session, you say, okay, we're going to wrap up. We're going to talk about what, we're going to, write a note about what we did today. And that's actually a great way to get feedback on what's important to your clients. Because how often have you had a client like tell you that you said something that you just made that comment flippantly, right? Like it wasn't like that you were making some big intervention or carefully drafted statement, but they thought it was so important. So it's kind of cool because it's a way to check in with your clients about what they're thinking about therapy, what's important to them, what they found helpful in that particular session. And if you struggle with ending sessions on time, it can kind of help that process too.
Nice, thank you. B, do we have anyone else that would like to come up and ask?
Yeah, I'd like to bring up Abby Rubin. You can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. It's been incredibly helpful. My question is, do you have any recommendations for how to tackle a significant note backlog?
Yes, thank you for asking the question. So again, ridiculously common problem. And so my recommendations are a few. Number one, you got to know how many notes you have to do, right? So if you use an electronic health record, a lot of times that's very easy. It gives you a number. Otherwise, you might have to go through. Number two, you're going to time yourself writing notes. So do this with current notes, not the past ones, because it takes longer to write older notes. So from like this week, right? For example, let's say you see 6 people over 2 days, time yourself writing all those notes and then average it out so you know exactly how long it takes you to write a note. That in itself can be so helpful for so many people. But it might take you 5 minutes to write a note. It might take you 25. I don't know, right? Once you have that, then you literally just multiply the average amount of time it takes you to write a note to how many notes you have to write. And then you know it's going to take me, for example, 40 hours to catch up on notes, right? Or 300 hours to catch up on notes. Then you can create a plan. And it can be scary to do that, but most people I talk to have a huge amount of relief after they know that number, because then it's like, okay, I know what I got to do. And so then you just, what I say is do not stop writing your current notes. That's a huge mistake I see a lot of people make, and it keeps you in that catch-up cycle. So have a current schedule, write that for your, make sure you're on top of current notes. And then for the catch-up notes, add like an hour to a day or a week or whatever you can manage, right? And just know it might take you 3 to 6 months. It might take you 6 months to a year. But I have seen people catch up on almost 1,000 notes. I've seen multiple people do that. So it is totally doable. But you got to know how long it takes you to write a note. And you have to first really focus on getting a schedule for your current notes so you don't continue as you tackle the backlog.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. So the next person I want to bring up is Myra. I know you had a question, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you for
Hi.
that wonderful discussion. I just want to ask if we can use your files as a template for us to create our own template here in the clinic, considering that it would be reflecting culture-based questions and also the practice itself. And the second would be, is it also relevant how we take down notes if it's online telehealth? Is it needed to be stored in a laptop, or is it preferred to be written on paper, just to make sure that there is no compromise in terms of confidentiality and other issues?
Yeah, I would say you can absolutely use my templates to create your own templates, and that's what I encourage you to do, tweak them so they work for you. And then the other question, electronic or paper is fine. They're really fairly equal at this point. I would say the downside to paper is, and this would also be if you just hold them on your computer and don't use like a cloud drive, like Google Drive or some kind of cloud storage. If you're just keeping them on your hard drive, is I know people have had their laptops stolen. I know people have had their offices burned down. I know people have had their offices flooded, right? So like your paper records are literally open to the elements. And so at this point, there's such good cloud-based systems. I usually recommend that, even if you don't use an electronic health record. And there's no reason to back up an electronic record with paper.
Perfect. Thank you for answering that for her. We have one more question from Anne. So you can go ahead and unmute yourself, Anne.
Hi, Melissa. Thank you. In terms of taking notes in the session, sometimes I find I write a lot because I don't want to miss things. And then when I go to summarize my notes on my laptop, I have a whole pile of information trying to streamline themes. How would you recommend taking notes in sessions so that it's a little bit easier to summarize in the end?
So my anecdotal experience, so this is not based on the research, is that is the key thing that leads to people falling behind in notes or overthinking their notes, taking notes during session, because then it's like I have this crutch. Like I can wait a little bit longer to write the note because I have, all these notes to myself. Now, being someone who part of my ADHD is like, I have a horrible memory, I get needing to write some things down just to remember them, right? So I would still do that. One of the things I've seen people do is use like a little white erase board, and they take notes themselves that way. And that keeps you, and then you have to wipe it off before you see the next person. So that keeps you making it succinct. And then you can like take a picture of it, or you can like jot it down on like in a note to get the note started really quickly. Those are some kind of like hacks that I've seen people use. But I would say, that it just leads to I've seen it lead to so many of the reasons why people are seeking me out for consultation. So as much as you can to stay away from writing notes during the session, unless you're actually writing it in like have the computer and you're writing it in what's going to actually be the note. right? So that it's just going to stay there and then you finish the note later.
Awesome. Maelissa, thank you so much for sharing your time and your knowledge with us today. We really appreciate it. And
thank you.